Moderating today's session is Brian Turner, poet, essayist, and professor who brings with him unique perspectives on these issues. The first of our panelists is a last-minute swap as Joy Burkhardt is sadly unable to join us today, but we are thrilled to welcome Adrienne Griffen in her stead. Adrienne is the Executive Director of the Maternal Mental Health Leadership Alliance. She will be joined by Prince Taylor, the National Director for the VA Center for Development and Civic Engagement, and Izzy Boring, a collegiate athlete and young adult advocate. Please join me in welcoming this tremendous group to the stage for a panel discussion.
How's everybody doing? All right, here's in the back. All right.
Should be what
We
it's
can turn these on. I
Yeah.
think we push these buttons. And there we go. Push the button, it stays on, I believe. So we don't want that. Right? I want that. Maybe a short poem. I'm a poet as well. I sat in that office where Lee was at his house there, not too long ago, actually. And I believe years ago, I have to ask him if it was in this class, but I believe I visited this class at one point. And I sat in there. There was another guest that day. And I wish I could remember the names. I was terrible with names. I don't remember the name of the poem. I don't remember the name of the poet. But the guest shared this poem. It was written by a 9-year-old student in China. Translated in English, very short poem. The boy looks at the bird. The bird looks at the boy. Where's the exit? Where's the exit? I'll say it one more time. The boy looks at the bird. The bird looks at the boy. Where's the exit? Where's the exit? And sometimes I think we can, this idea of being sort of trapped and isolated within the cell, and not being able to move beyond the cell. There's something fascinates me. I'll just add a brief note because we've just met with myself. I come from Fresno, California, the same valley that he was speaking to us from. I was a soldier in the Iraq War, a widower. I'm also a dog owner. The owner is a weird word. I don't think it's the right word. I live with a dog who rescues me daily. And I really mean that. It helps me to be able to smile, and I'm still working on that part. It helped me to really laugh again. It's almost impossible not to laugh when you're around a puppy. You know what I mean? And so there's so many things about your experiences that I've already been researching and trying to be prepared for this moment. It just resonated with me in so many different ways. But I wonder if each of you people might start with the preservative defense. I hope so. Okay. I think always. Yeah. And maybe if you could add a bit more, tell us a bit more about your story and where you're coming from, and how that connects with our conversation on isolation and connectivity. Where to begin?
No, so I also am a Navy vet, and my connection to loneliness sort of happenstance, and I'm sure we'll get more into that. But a little bit more about me is I have a mother who has mental health issues. I have a brother who has mental health issues. I heard the gentleman speaking earlier about gentlemen that end up in gangs and stuff like that, looking for a connection. My little brother was one of those people. I just looked in a different direction in our lives. Pretty much ended up completely different. But also just knowing that there are other people out there that need help. It's a really important work that we're doing here. And I'm just happy to be part of the conversation of move things forward.
Thank you. And Izzy, it's very nice to meet you as well. And I hope you don't mind, but I know in social media there's a really fascinating video where you tell your story. I think there may be more than one. So if folks don't get enough here, that might be, I don't know if you want to share with them afterwards, but there's an amazing video that tells more. So I'd love to hear it from them.
Yeah, so my name is Izzy Boring, and I just want to preface by saying it's such an honor just being in this room with all of these really inspiring people and just change makers, and just to have my story be heard is just such an honor to me. But I'm 20 years old and I'm a collegiate athlete at Corbin University in Salem, Oregon. I grew up in a really small town, Kettle Falls, Washington State, across the country. So flew pretty far to be here. But I'm just here because I've felt loneliness. I've been isolated, I've chosen to isolate myself. And I've deeply felt disconnect from the people around me. And just briefly part of my story, when I was 8 years old, my dad had been sentenced to 6 years in prison. And so from a young age of 8, I felt this feeling of lonely and I didn't know how to address that. And, you know, being 8 years old, I hardly knew how to tie my shoes. I hardly knew how to add and subtract. And yet I was forced into navigating these feelings of loss and abandonment and sadness and anger and this feeling of unworthiness. And how does an 8-year-old navigate that instead of I got pushed into feeling lonely and then growing up. I had a pretty normal high school and middle school experience. I played sports, I attended dances, but it wasn't until the end of my high school experience where my world kind of turned upside down. In my senior year of high school, I was dating what I considered the love of my life. He was my best friend. I did everything with him. And little did I know he also struggled with loneliness and fought his own battle against loneliness. And unfortunately, he felt as if he couldn't fight that anymore. And on March 17th, 2021, he took his own life. And being young and experiencing that sort of loss I was shoved into this journey of grief and not knowing how to navigate that. Loneliness became a really close companion to me. And so, like I said, it's just such an honor to be here and to be a voice to others who haven't been able to voice those certain things. It's just super special to me. So thank you.
Adrienne, thank you for coming in. And the last minute, you're pinch hitting me coming on this. I don't know if you found out about it 5 minutes before. Thank you for doing that.
I'm so happy to be here, and we talk about loneliness. So, colleague who I'm replacing, she flew here from California and is sick in her hotel room. So talk about being isolated and lonely. So it's an honor to be here and to talk about this really important issue. In my job, I work for policies around maternal mental health. Many of you are probably familiar with the term postpartum depression. Being a new mom at home with an alien who eats and poops all day long and not being connected to the outside world can be one of the most isolating and lonely experiences. I had significant postpartum depression after one of my 3 children was born. And it fundamentally rocked my world and changed my life and made me an advocate for maternal mental health issues. And so this whole conversation about isolation and loneliness, and why did that cross over into mental illness and depression, and how can we separate out the two? I don't know. But I like the idea that we're talking about this, and I like that we're talking about mental health and not mental illness. And I'm just really excited to be part of this conversation. I want to thank my 2 panelists for your service to our country, and look forward to continuing conversation.
If I remember right, not hold that for a second. Do you mind sharing some of the factors that contribute to the populations that you serve and work with? Can you talk about some of the factors that contribute to loneliness? Start with one.
First of all, I am here in my personal capacity. I want to understand that. But I am very much interested in the veteran experience. And before I answer your question, I just want to give a really quick story because we were talking a little bit about the pandemic earlier. And when the pandemic first started, one of the things that I was really afraid of was a spike in veteran suicides, because we already know that, I think this is open source information, that we have an issue with that. But what a lot of people don't realize is that those numbers actually started trending downward. And it wasn't precipitous, but they started going downward, not upward. And I spoke to some of my friends who clearly experienced a lot of loneliness and depression and yada, yada, yada. And I said, how does this make sense? And they said, well, for a few months, the rest of the world got to see what we experience every day. And so they didn't feel so lonely anymore. Those numbers started going back up in June and July, when the rest of us were like, freedom! And we started going back out trying to socially acclimate. But for them, their normal was the social isolation and the loneliness. And so they started going back, those numbers started going back to the way they were before. What's your question?
What do you think are some of the factors might contribute to?
Right. Factors that, well, number one, the stigma, you're in the military as well, and so you know that there is definitely a machismo about it. So we don't like to admit any sort of weaknesses, any sort of vulnerabilities, but the fact of the matter is, our veterans, they are most vulnerable that first year and a half after they get out of the military. And part of that's that disconnection. You have a mission every day, and now all of a sudden, you don't have a mission, and you're around a bunch of people that are like aliens, like these babies, they're like aliens to you. And so that's part of it. The other part, and I hope we get deeper into this, is that a lot of our clinicians don't know what to do with it because it's not a clinical condition. And so for them, it's like chicken or egg. Are you lonely because you're depressed, or are you depressed because you're lonely? And we have not figured that out as a society, but to me, if we don't know the answer to that, we need to stop treating it the same like we do. I hope that answers.
Well, we need, maybe 6 more months to be talking about it.
Sorry, yeah.
No, not at all. Is it too much?
Yeah, for me, I think factors that lead to at least young adults feeling lonely is we don't know how to talk about it. And I think that's the biggest thing is, and like I said, I was 8 years old. How do I, one, identify these feelings? Like, I don't know what abandonment is. I don't know how to process anger. I don't know how to process sadness. And no one taught me how to do that. It's not something I learned in school, and, no fault to parents, but sometimes it's hardly something our parents teach us because unfortunately their parents didn't teach them and their parents didn't teach them. And so I think as a society, this unknown and not knowing how to talk about it is just so deeply embedded. And so as young adults, and I think as people who are now recognizing that there is a mental health crisis, we don't know the right words to say. And so I think oftentimes that pushes us into this isolation, and we're so afraid of not knowing what to say, and we're so afraid that we might say the wrong thing and that our feelings won't be validated, that we just instead don't say anything at all. And I think that is one of the biggest factors of just my generation's loneliness, is just this fear of not being accepted.
And a lot of residents in different communities. Adrienne, does that resonate with some of the communities that you work with as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we talk about new parents feeling isolated and lonely as what is supposed to be the most joyous time in their life, right? Bring a new baby home, and for a mother or father to acknowledge that they're not happy, that they feel sad, that they're grieving the life that they were living before the baby was born, that they're not happy, that they're isolated and home alone. There's a lot of shame that goes around that as well. And I just, in many years of working with new moms, I just ask new parents, how are you doing? It can be very joyful to bring a new baby home, but it can be really, really stressful and isolating and alone. How's it going for you? And that sort of like normalizes it, gives the person the opportunity to talk without them having to say, oh, I'm feeling sad or alone. So I think all of us in general, we're talking to people, just how are you doing? I'm having a tough time. I had a tough time. How about you? It just sort of, we all go through it at some point, it being the shit of life, right? At some point, either you've been through it or you're going to go through it. Nobody's life is perfect. And so just sort of acknowledging that up front. I look at all of you all look so perfect. I'm guessing there are people in here who are feeling sad and alone, just sitting here. I remember, again, when I had postpartum depression 21 years ago, my son, remember he was born right before Christmas. And so all of our family came for Christmas, and I was sitting in our room full of all of my favorite people. And I felt so alone, like nobody could feel the despair that I was feeling. And so I know that we all probably feel that at some point in our life. And so it does make us empathetic to others.
As a child, I remember I had a massive stutter, a stammer. I think it was really more appropriate. Such a stammer that it would stop me from being able to complete a sentence. That lasted well into my 20s. And people would finish, my best friends would finish sentences for me. It was so frustrating because they didn't know what I was going to say. They just tried to go with it as best they could. And even when they did, So that was isolating. We moved out to the country, so I lived in a rural part of America. I think cities have a different way of isolating, and rural parts is another type of isolation. Loneliness sort of shows itself in different ways. When I was in the army, we would do this and thinking about articulate, how do we find language for these things? In the military, oftentimes, basic procedure as an infantry soldier would be when you're either in training or in combat is that's before you go, you do different tests, you check your equipment, you do inventories, you do physical tests to see how fast you can run, how many push-ups you do, things like that. You go out and do some like an exercise or actual combat, and you come back, you redeploy, and when you redeploy, you assess it. You look at the equipment, you lay it all out and see what's missing. Are we gonna replace that? What's damaged? You need to fix that. And before you can go home, you have to go to a PT testing to see where you are physically. Oh, we're getting a little slow. We need more aerobic health. We need some more push-up work. Right? But the one thing that I didn't see happening is what runs the whole thing. You know, so the spirit, mind, body, and part of the experience of finding, being able to articulate that, be able to talk and make it cultural and institutional and structural. That seems like a huge part of where humanity has to go. And one of, I shared a bit about stammering and whatever. I'm wondering, those who work with yourselves, can you share some of the thoughts of the felt sort of real world effect that it has for folks? If that question makes sense.
Yeah, the real world effects of loneliness.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mentioned that loneliness is, well, it's not a clinical condition, but it can lead to clinical conditions. It puts you at higher risk for morbidity and substance abuse. But we know that it can lead to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations. We know that loneliness does that. So I need to stop pussyfooting and pretending that those are not the facts. Those are the facts, according to Prince, speaking for himself. But the thing is that there are tools out there that we have right now, and a lot of it goes back to community. I'm really looking forward to what Senator Smith is talking about with social determinants of health. That's another way to tackle it. Programs like this and organizations like this. But if I can just speak about the clinicians again, just real briefly, they recognize loneliness all the time, but they don't know what to do with it. And so what I would really love to see is they start clinically identifying it, or even non-clinically identifying it with something like a UCLA 3-questionnaire thing, where they say this, this, and this, you might be experiencing loneliness. Now let's do something about it, which could be a social prescription, which is something they've been doing overseas for years now. Those are real simple things that we can also do. I hope it answers your question, because I'm passionate about it, because you're talking about language. And I think that a lot of veterans also didn't have language, but we are developing the language now. And I don't think we have to wait until it's perfect before we do something. And I'm really sorry for your loss.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, just the impact of loneliness and what it has on my generation, I think I'm going to be blunt and I'm just going to say the loss of life, I think, is the impact of loneliness. I saw it firsthand. I've experienced it firsthand in moments when I felt alone. My first thought, my first instinct was, I have to give up. Like, there's no point. Like, I'm so alone with these feelings. No one's going to understand these feelings. What's the point? And I think the same thing that happened with my boyfriend. He felt so alone with his feelings. And even though he was surrounded by people who absolutely loved him, by a community who was an all-star basketball player, state MVP, like praised among the highest in the state, he still felt alone. And even though he had all these honors, all these accomplishments, this loneliness took over. And I think, like you said, we have to stop beating around the bush of the impacts of loneliness, because I experienced it and I saw firsthand, and I felt the trickling effect of how loneliness can be deadly and how it can lead to things like that. I would just say my biggest piece of advice, and something that we can start doing, is just creating a space for people to be heard, and especially people my age. thankfully, and I'm just so blessed to be here. Like I have a space to be heard and I have a place where I can share my story. And I don't think you guys realize how impactful that is for me and my life. And even in the midst of my grief and in my darkest moments, I was given an opportunity with Only 7 Seconds, which is a nonprofit out of Chelan, Washington. And they gave me a space to share my story. And just to have my story shared and then in turn heard by other people and have people come back and say that it was impactful and they felt like they weren't alone was so powerful. And there's a quote who I don't know who it's by, but it goes along the way of there's someone out there who has a wound the exact same size of your words. And I think that is so powerful. And I think our solution is just giving young adults a space to be heard. And it doesn't have to be some grandiose thing. And I'm very lucky to be here and have my share heard in the US Capitol. Not every young adult is going to have that. I wish they could. That'd be awesome. But I think it is as simple as creating space in your homes for your young adults to be heard, creating space in schools for these people to be heard, creating space among your peers, among your friend groups, among your sports teams for these people to be heard. And I think too, we almost try and formulate and calculate this perfect conversation to have and be like, oh, how are you doing it? It has to go a certain way. I think we got to make these conversations as normal as possible because these are very normal feelings. Loneliness is such a normal feeling. And I think these conversations need to be as normal as having it between parent and child, teacher and student, between friends, between strangers in grocery stores. And I think we have such a special opportunity now. And even having this event is just so amazing. It's such a step forward to begin these conversations. But we have such a special opportunity as these people hearing this to create those spaces for other people and for young adults. I think it's our turn to talk, and now it's our turn to be heard as well. So thank you for that.
I really like your words. I do. I think you are really. That's why I was trying not to go after. I think I believe in the power of volunteers. I think that there are a lot of people out there that want to be part of the solution. The program that I helped to start, and there's a lady in this room who's actually running with it and making it succeed beyond my wildest dreams, actually, Lori Murphy. But when we started our program, we thought that we should, after about a year, ask the population that we were trying to impact with this intervention, how it was working for them. And I believe it was like 87% said that it did make them feel less lonely. But somewhere in our wisdom, and it was probably hers, we decided to also ask the volunteers. And about 82% said that it made them feel less lonely. So we were actually affecting two populations, even though our target was only one. So we can't tell this that the volunteers don't get something out of it as well. And the great thing about social media and technology now is that it doesn't simply have to be your next door neighbor. You really can connect with people all over the world. And we've been doing that with our program, but I don't think that that this is unique to just what we're doing wherever I am.
That's phenomenal. I was thinking that's similar in some ways to in a smaller way for me. For those who are watching online, there may be some veterans out there, perhaps, or military families, and part of my work is sometimes to try to create expressive writing opportunities in times to be able to articulate things that may happen in the experiences we might have, put them into language and put them on page so we can share them with others, really sharing stories. There's such a healthy benefit from that I find personally as a writer too. So I try to work with veterans and their family members to see if we might not only write about those difficult times, but also to get tools to find a way to write the way into the rest of our lives. And to cross borders too. So part of the work that I like to be interested in is for example, following the footsteps of the William Joynerson for the study of conflict and social consequences. Vietnam veterans started pairing with writers in Vietnam that they had been adversaries with before, and then getting a conversation. And that has had a lot of healthy after the benefits from afterwards. So the only reason I share this is smaller pitch for those who might be out there watching. If that's of interest, you can contact me, the publisher, or there's a lot of ways to contact me. I'm happy to put you in touch with people so that you might create other types of community as well. Regardless of me, it's been a real honor and pleasure to meet the three of you. It's far too short a time. I know that there's going to be a reception after this, so I'm sure that each of us will get a chance to talk with them. I hope you're all able to stay for at least a little bit. And when I said 6 months, I wasn't joking. Easily 6 months or whatever it might be. So much information. So thank you for this time. Hopefully we can.